Everyone mocked when a broke millionaire adopted a homeless girl. Then he learns she's a genius. Before starting to watch this story, tell us in the comments section from which city you're watching this story. Let's enjoy this story. Daniel Reese sat in the back seat of his old Toyota Camry, staring blankly through the cracked windshield at the flickering neon sign of a 24-hour diner in Boise, Idaho. Just 2 years ago he used to cruise down the streets of San Francisco in a sleek black Tesla, sipping imported coffee and managing million-dollar deals from the comfort of his customized office overlooking the bay. But fortunes change fast in America. One wrong investment in a biotech startup, one trusted partner turning rogue, and one devastating lawsuit later. Daniel's empire crumbled like a sandcastle against a rising tide. The man who once trended on LinkedIn for his ruthless business instincts, now nursed his bruised pride in cheap motels and low-rent diners, scraping by with whatever dignity he had left. He'd sold his last luxury watch to keep his phone connected and drove his Camry across states, trying to avoid places that still remembered his name. At 42, Daniel wasn't broken in the physical sense. His body still worked, his mind still calculated, but his spirit, once filled with ambition and dominance, was drained. He'd stopped looking at himself in mirrors. The man who stared back wore disappointment like a second skin. Some days he didn't even recognize his own voice. He tried applying for jobs, but no one hired a former millionaire with a scandal attached to his name. Especially not one who'd once fired people like a machine, heartlessly, publicly, and with the belief that money could forgive everything. But it doesn't. It was a cold Monday morning when Daniel first saw her. She was curled up in a tattered blanket near the alley behind the diner, hugging her knees tightly, her thin frame trembling from the biting wind. Most people walked past, pretending she didn't exist. That was the way the world worked. Avoid eye contact, avoid responsibility. Daniel didn't want to get involved either. He had enough problems of his own. But something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the way she stared straight ahead, not with the emptiness of despair but with a quiet awareness, as if she was watching the world, studying it. She looked about 12 or 13, but it was hard to tell through the layers of dirt and clothes that didn't fit. Her hair was messy, but her eyes were sharp in a way that reminded Daniel of boardrooms and negotiation tables. He handed her a cup of hot cocoa he'd bought for himself. She took it without saying a word. He turned to walk away but then heard her voice, dry but firm. "You shouldn't have wasted your money on me." Daniel turned back. "I didn't," he replied. She looked at him with one eyebrow slightly raised as if she didn't believe a word. People don't just give things without expecting something. Especially not these days. Daniel chuckled bitterly. "You're not wrong." She sipped the cocoa and said nothing more. That was their first interaction. The next day he brought her a sandwich. Then a coat. He didn't know why. Maybe because helping someone else made his own failure feel less heavy. Maybe because he saw a little of his younger self in her, alone, underestimated, observant. She told him her name was Lacey. No last name. She'd been on the streets for almost a year. Her mom had died from an overdose in Spokane, and her stepfather had disappeared with a truckload of debt. No family, no system to catch her. She'd wandered, surviving on scraps, stealing once or twice, sleeping in shelters when she got lucky. Daniel didn't ask too many questions. He knew enough to understand her world had taught her to trust no one. Over the next few weeks they started talking more. Not the kind of forced small talk Daniel was used to from networking events but real conversations. Lacey had an uncanny ability to notice things. She'd observe people in the diner and predict their next move. She once described the entire business model of the place based on how the owner arranged the condiments. She'd draw complicated shapes in the air, trying to explain systems she had imagined. Daniel, curious, bought her a notebook and pen. She filled it with diagrams, equations, and bizarre, yet oddly brilliant, designs for machines that didn't exist yet. She'd never been to school consistently, but she talked about physics and coding like someone who'd been born with a laptop in her hands. At first he thought it was a fluke. Maybe she'd read some books, watched some videos on a library computer. But then she solved a puzzle from a torn-up math magazine that even Daniel couldn't make sense of. He took a picture and posted it anonymously on a tech forum, just to see what others thought. Within hours he got replies from engineers and mathematicians asking who had solved it. One user messaged him privately, asking if the solver had a background in advanced logic systems. Daniel didn't know what he was looking at, but he knew talent when he saw it. The same instincts that had once made him millions were now screaming that this girl wasn't just smart, she was exceptional. A diamond in the mud. And the more he learned about her, the more protective he felt. It wasn't pity, it was admiration. Lacey didn't complain. She didn't beg. She absorbed the world around her like a sponge and turned that knowledge into something tangible. When he told a former colleague about her, the man laughed out loud. "You've lost it, Reese. Adopting a homeless street kid? You're not just broke, you're insane now too." Others followed suit. Former partners, investors, even some of his own family. "You can't save the world," they mocked. "You couldn't even save your own company." But Daniel didn't care anymore about their opinions. The world had watched him fall, and now it would watch something far more interesting. He didn't know what would come next. He wasn't sure how to navigate guardianship laws or schools, or what exactly Lacey needed beyond food and warmth. But he knew she needed a home. And maybe, just maybe, she could help him find one too. Before going to next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The snow was falling lightly over Helena, Montana, the sky a thick gray blanket pressing down on the world below. Daniel had driven north with Lacey tucked quietly in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was calculating the distance to the moon. The decision to leave Boise hadn't been planned. Nothing about Daniel's life was planned anymore. The morning after one of their longer conversations, about probability and chaos theory of all things, he realized that leaving her behind would be the one regret he could never forgive himself for. She didn't ask questions when he offered her a permanent place with him. She didn't even say yes out loud. She simply climbed into the car, carrying nothing but the notebook he'd given her and a backpack with 2 shirts, a water bottle, and a broken watch she said once belonged to her mother. They reached a quiet rental cabin on the outskirts of Helena, a place Daniel had found online. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a rickety furnace, and a view of a frozen lake, but it was theirs. The rent was cheap and the owner didn't ask questions. Daniel figured he had just enough savings to last 3 or 4 more months if they lived frugally. He cooked simple meals, taught Lacey how to do laundry, and tried to pretend he knew what he was doing. Truthfully, he didn't. He was a man used to managing millions, not lives. But in some strange, quiet way they adapted. Lacey was silent for the first week, only speaking when she had something important to say. Her words were always measured, deliberate, like a chess move. Daniel respected that about her. He didn't push. He let the silence be what it was. One night, while they were eating grilled cheese on paper plates, Daniel turned on an old radio in the kitchen. A talk show was on, something about education funding in rural states. Lacey listened for a few minutes, then mumbled something about how the funding model was flawed. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How do you know that?" She shrugged. "I read about Title I grants in a library once. They allocate based on census data, but the data's already outdated by the time they issue the funds." Daniel blinked. "That's actually true." She gave a small smile, almost like she was amused by his surprise. "I'm not just good at numbers. I remember everything I read. I don't know why, I just do." That's when it started to click for him. She wasn't just observant, she had a photographic memory, combined with a logic-oriented brain and the kind of raw intelligence that could easily be missed in a school classroom where no one ever bothered to ask the right questions. That night, while she slept curled up under 3 blankets on the old couch, Daniel pulled out her notebook again. He flipped through the pages with a mix of awe and confusion. There were sketches of machines, strange circuits, codes, even algorithms. He didn't understand most of it, but the complexity was undeniable. One particular drawing caught his attention, a compact turbine system with a note scribbled next to it: reusable energy, 40% more efficient if velocity controlled by temp-based algorithm. It made no sense to him, but it sounded like something an MIT intern might obsess over. The next day, Daniel drove into town and used the public library computer to email a friend from his old life, Julia Blake, a mechanical engineer who now worked with an energy tech company in Denver, Colorado. He scanned one of Lacey's designs and asked if she'd take a look, anonymously. The reply came that evening. "Who drew this? Because if this isn't stolen from a patent, it's one of the most interesting drafts I've seen all year. We've been trying to solve a similar efficiency loss problem in microturbines. Where did this come from?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked at Lacey, who was by the window, watching the snowfall like it was a language she was trying to learn. He realized something deeper than pride was forming in him. He felt protective but also inspired, like she had a purpose that had nothing to do with him, and he was just lucky to be witnessing it. Later that week, Lacey found a disassembled radio in a junk drawer in the cabin. Within an hour she had it working again, clearer than before. She explained the circuit rerouting she'd done, using words Daniel barely followed. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Nowhere," she said. "I just figure it out. I see how things connect." I like fixing broken stuff. The way she said it, Daniel couldn't help but feel like she was talking about more than radios. He wanted to tell her she wasn't broken, but the words felt clumsy, and Lacey wasn't one for emotional speeches. So he just nodded. Over the next few days, Daniel started writing a plan. He knew he had limited time before his savings ran out. He needed work. But more than that, he needed to protect Lacey's future. Her talent was rare. If she was discovered by the wrong people, they'd exploit her. He had seen it happen in his old world. So he reached out to Julia again, this time with honesty. He told her everything. About Lacey. About her living on the streets. About the sketches. About how everyone thought he was crazy for taking her in. Julia didn't respond for 2 days. Then came a short message: fly to Denver. Bring her. I'll introduce you to someone at the institute. Daniel showed it to Lacey. You want to go? He asked. She looked hesitant for the first time. Will they put me in foster care? He shook his head. Not if I can help it. She stared at the message again, then nodded slowly. Then let's go. Before going to next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The drive from Helena to Denver took nearly 10 hours, but neither Daniel nor Lacey complained. They left early in the morning, the Montana sky still a shade of blue-gray, and by the time they crossed into Wyoming, the sun had begun to break through the clouds. Daniel watched Lacey through the corner of his eye as she scribbled equations and symbols in her notebook, her lips moving silently as if she were solving invisible puzzles in her head. She didn't ask where they were going exactly or who they were meeting. She simply trusted him, and that terrified Daniel more than anything. He hadn't been trusted in years, not by investors, not by family, not even by himself. He didn't want to fail her. By the time they arrived in Denver, night had fallen and the city lights sparkled like gold dust scattered over the horizon. The air was thinner, colder. Daniel had booked a cheap motel just outside of downtown. Lacey walked in silently, dropped her backpack by the wall, and sat cross-legged on the bed. She didn't ask for food, though he knew she hadn't eaten since noon. Instead, she pulled a blanket over her legs and kept writing. Daniel heated a frozen meal in the microwave and handed it to her. Eat, he said gently. She took it without a word, like it was an unspoken contract between them. I'll eat if you keep believing in me. The next morning, they met Julia Blake outside the Colorado Energy Research Institute, a sharp, glass-fronted building surrounded by snow-dusted pines. Julia looked almost exactly as Daniel remembered her, tall, practical, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She shook Daniel's hand, then turned to Lacey. So you're the prodigy, she said, offering a smile. Lacey didn't smile back, but she nodded. I don't know if I'm that, she replied, but I'm good at solving things. Julia gave a small chuckle. That's good enough for me. Inside the building, Julia introduced them to Dr. Elliot Crane, a soft-spoken engineer with a quiet intensity. He didn't say much during the first part of the meeting. Julia laid out some of Lacey's designs and walked him through Daniel's story. Elliot asked only one question. Did she design this turbine model herself? Lacey answered with confidence. I designed it in my head last month. I drew it out later. Elliot stared at her for a moment, then pushed a notebook toward her. Here's a challenge, he said. We've been trying to correct phase interference in nanoturbine fields. Think you can find a better circuit map? Lacey nodded, pulled a pen from her pocket and got to work. For 20 minutes there was silence. The adults watched as Lacey's hand flew over the page, drawing diagrams and jotting annotations like she was copying something already perfectly formed in her brain. Finally she slid the notebook back. Elliot blinked. Well, he said, flipping through the pages, this just saved us 6 weeks. Julia raised her eyebrows. Is it really that good? Elliot looked at Lacey. This kid doesn't belong in a foster system. She belongs in a lab. Daniel felt a swell of pride so strong it nearly knocked the air out of him. But the moment was cut short by reality. Elliot leaned forward. Look, I'd love to bring her into our mentorship program. We've partnered with local charter schools. But the problem is, she's not enrolled in any school. No birth certificate, no ID, no guardian record. If anything goes wrong, this becomes a legal nightmare. Julia chimed in. The system won't allow her to stay in this building unless someone officially takes responsibility. Daniel knew what they were saying. He took a breath and said, Then I'll do it. I'll apply for temporary guardianship. Whatever it takes. Julia and Elliot exchanged glances. It's not easy, she warned. You're not her relative and you don't have a steady job. Daniel looked at Lacey, then back at them. I'll figure it out. That night they returned to the motel. Lacey didn't say much, but before going to sleep she looked at Daniel and said, "You don't have to do all this. I know I'm just a problem for you." Daniel sat beside her. "You're not a problem. You're a miracle I wasn't expecting." The next few days were a blur of paperwork. Daniel visited the county clerk's office, filled out guardianship forms, and spent hours on hold with state agencies. He even contacted an old lawyer friend from Seattle to guide him through the process. Meanwhile, Lacey returned to the lab with Julia, working on simulations that stunned everyone around her. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by to check in and found her explaining a coding issue to a group of interns in their 20s. They listened to her like she was a visiting professor. She looked up, saw him, and gave the tiniest smile. It was the first time she ever smiled first. News of Lacey's work began spreading quietly within the institute. A few professors offered to sponsor her for private school. One even suggested contacting a university. But everything hinged on Daniel's guardianship being approved. Without it, Lacey would be pulled into state custody, placed in a group home, maybe separated from him forever. The thought filled Daniel with panic. He had lost everything once before. He couldn't lose her. Then one morning a letter arrived at the motel. It was from the Denver family court. Daniel opened it with shaking hands. Temporary guardianship granted. Valid for 12 months. Renewal subject to court review. He dropped the paper and sat down hard on the bed. When Lacey returned from the lab that evening, he handed her the letter. She read it, looked up, and said only 2 words, "Thank you." Daniel nodded, his voice catching in his throat. "We're just getting started." Before going to next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm neither Daniel nor Lacey had known in a long time. Each morning, Daniel dropped Lacey off at the Colorado Energy Research Institute, where she was working part-time under Dr. Elliott's mentorship, and then he spent his days navigating part-time jobs to support them, driving for a rideshare service, doing evening inventory shifts at a warehouse near Aurora, and even handing out samples at a local grocery store when hours were available. He didn't mind the exhaustion. For the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond survival. It wasn't about rebuilding his own fortune anymore. It was about giving Lacey a shot at a life she didn't even know was possible. Every night, they returned to their small motel room with 2 creaky beds and an old TV that barely worked. Lacey, usually tired but wired from all the work she'd done that day, would open her notebook, dive into algorithms or circuit designs, and mutter things under her breath like she was in a race with herself. Daniel watched her sometimes, amazed at how her brain seemed to run on a completely different frequency. She wasn't just smart, she was driven, almost obsessively so. He often wondered where it came from, how someone who'd lived on the streets and had nothing could possess such relentless focus. One Saturday morning, Dr. Elliott called Daniel and asked if he and Lacey could attend a special event the following week. "It's a small tech conference at the University of Colorado Boulder," he explained. "Not a huge crowd. But there'll be a few scouts from MIT and Stanford. They're always looking for talent." Daniel hesitated. "She's only 14. Elliott replied, "They don't need a high school diploma to recognize brilliance. Just bring her. Let her talk to the people who matter." When Daniel told Lacey, her eyes widened. Not in fear, but in something close to disbelief. "They want to hear me talk?" she asked. "Like really listen?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. Because they see what you are." They drove to Boulder that Thursday with Lacey dressed in the only decent outfit she owned, a blue sweater and black jeans Daniel had bought from a thrift store. She clutched her sketchbook tightly in the car, flipping through pages filled with mathematical diagrams and energy flow charts. "What if they laugh at me?" she asked quietly. "What if they think I'm some weird kid from nowhere?" Daniel reached over and placed a hand gently on her arm. "Then they're not as smart as they think. Just be yourself, Lace." The university was buzzing with students and visitors when they arrived. The conference was set up in a smaller lecture hall, with around 100 attendees, tech experts, researchers, and a few high school students presenting their science fair projects. Lacey stood at a poster board Elliott had helped her prepare, showcasing her model for an energy-efficient vertical turbine design. At first, only a few people approached her booth, asking routine questions. But then she started explaining her concept, not in stiff, rehearsed phrases, but in her usual hyper-focused way. Within 20 minutes, a crowd had gathered. One man asked where she'd learned her math. "Nowhere really," she said. "I just see it in my head. It's like music but with numbers." Another asked if she had any professional training. "I used to read science magazines in the library," she said. "And sometimes I watched university lectures on a broken tablet someone threw out." Daniel stood a few steps away, watching as people took her contact information, asking if she was applying for early admission anywhere. She smiled awkwardly, giving short answers, but Daniel could see the confidence blooming in her eyes. She was being taken seriously for the first time in her life, and it was changing something inside her. A man in his 50s with gray hair and a Stanford lanyard leaned in toward Daniel. "You her father?" he asked. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I am." The man smiled. "She's one of the sharpest kids I've seen in years. That mind of hers? Don't let anyone put a ceiling over it." Later that evening, back at the motel, Lacey sat in silence, staring at the ceiling. Daniel assumed she was tired, but then she spoke. "No one ever looked at me like that before," she said. "Like I belong somewhere." Daniel turned off the lights and lay down on his bed. "You do belong," he said. "You always have. It just took the world a while to catch up." The next morning, Daniel received an email from one of the people who had attended the event. It was from a professor at MIT offering to set up a virtual mentorship program for Lacey, online classes, lab work, and eventually, a formal recommendation if she wanted to apply. Daniel showed her the email and she just stared at it, her lips trembling. "Is this real?" she whispered. "They want me?" Daniel nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, they really do." But as the opportunities grew, so did the pressure. Child Services had started checking in more frequently after learning about the guardianship. They weren't convinced that a man living in a motel with no stable income was the best fit for a minor, no matter how gifted she was. One officer hinted that Lacey might be better placed in a foster home with more structure. "We're not questioning your intentions," she said. "But this is an unusual arrangement." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. The idea of Lacey being taken away now, after everything, was unbearable. That night he sat in the parking lot outside the motel for hours, wondering how to protect her. He couldn't lose her now. Not when she was finally starting to believe in herself. The next day he made a decision. He would apply for full legal guardianship, not temporary, not just for show. He would prove to the court that he could provide a stable home. That meant finding a better job, securing a real apartment, and showing income records. It wouldn't be easy, but he'd faced worse odds before. Daniel looked over at Lacey, who was humming softly to herself while assembling a small wind turbine model with pieces from a broken fan. She had no idea how close they were to losing everything again. And he vowed, right there and then, that he would never let her fall through the cracks again. Before going to next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of the motel bed long after Lacey had drifted off, watching the city lights flicker across the ceiling. The thought of losing her gnawed at him like rust on metal. He had been broke before, he had known what it felt like to sleep in his car, to eat crackers for dinner, but the fear of going back wasn't about hunger anymore. It was about watching the one good thing that had happened in years be taken from him because of bureaucracy and numbers on paper. So the next morning he got to work. He called every contact he had left in Denver, people from his old business circles who had watched him rise and fall. Most didn't answer. A few offered empty sympathy. But one, Martha Hensley, a real estate investor he'd once helped out of a bad deal, agreed to meet for coffee. They sat in a quiet cafe off Colfax Avenue, a place Daniel used to frequent when life looked different. Martha was older now, her hair more silver than blonde, but her eyes were just as sharp. She listened carefully as Daniel explained everything, about Lacey, the motel, the guardianship, and the threat from Child Services. Martha tapped her spoon against her cup thoughtfully. "You're not asking for charity," she said. "You want a way to stand on your own again." Daniel nodded. "I just need one shot. A small property management gig. Anything. I can handle repairs, tenants, books, just give me a chance to build something stable." Martha hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "I've got a duplex in Wheat Ridge. One tenant moved out last week, and the other side needs maintenance. If you can fix it up and manage both units, I'll let you live in one rent-free for 6 months. After that, we renegotiate. Deal?" Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. "Yes, deal. Absolutely." He picked up the keys that afternoon. The duplex was old but livable, with creaky floors, stained carpets, and a backyard full of weeds. But to Daniel it looked like a castle. He surprised Lacey after school by driving her straight there. She was confused at first, then cautious. "Whose place is this?" she asked. "Ours," Daniel said. "We're moving out of the motel." For a moment she just stood in the doorway, stunned. Then she smiled, this slow, disbelieving smile that made Daniel's chest tighten. "We have a home," she whispered. "Like, with a real kitchen and everything?" Daniel nodded. "Yep. real kitchen, and a bedroom that doesn't smell like other people's socks. They moved in that weekend. Daniel spent his mornings fixing leaky faucets and repainting the living room, his afternoons managing the duplex and learning the ropes of property management from Martha, and his evenings doing gig work to cover food and utilities. Lacey helped when she could, painting trim, planting wildflowers in the backyard, setting up her makeshift study corner in the sunny back room. She was still attending her mentorship sessions virtually with MIT, still scribbling formulas on the walls like they were wallpaper, and still talking about things Daniel barely understood. But now, everything felt different. There was structure. There was routine. And there was hope. Child services came again 2 weeks later. This time Daniel was ready. He gave them a tour of the duplex, showed proof of income from the property management job, presented a binder with Lacey's schoolwork, online class logs and mentorship documentation. The caseworker, a stern woman named Judith, seemed impressed. She made notes, asked a few questions about meals and routines, then finally closed her folder. "This is an improvement," she said. "We'll need to do one more follow-up, but it's clear she's in a better place now." Daniel nodded politely, but inside he wanted to cry with relief. Things began to move faster after that. Lacey's wind turbine design caught the attention of a startup incubator in San Francisco. They offered her a spot in a summer research program, all expenses paid. Daniel was hesitant, she was only 14, but Dr. Elliott assured him that she would be safe and well supervised. Lacey was over the moon. "They're going to let me work in an actual lab," she told Daniel, almost whispering like she didn't believe her own words. "Not just some classroom. A real lab with real scientists." Daniel drove her to the airport himself, packing her suitcase with snacks, second-hand clothes, and a small note that just said, "You're already changing the world. Keep going." That summer was hard for Daniel. The house felt empty without Lacey's humming and chatter. He worked more shifts, fixed more toilets, painted more walls. But every few days he got an email or a call from her. Updates about the project, pictures of lab equipment, awkward selfies with mentors who were blown away by her ideas. "They said my model might work better than their current prototype," she told him once, her voice shaking with excitement. "They want to test it on a wind farm in Oregon." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was the same girl who had once dug through dumpsters for food. Now she was consulting on energy infrastructure. When she returned at the end of the summer, she had changed. Not just physically, though she looked taller, more confident, but in her eyes. There was purpose there. She didn't just believe in herself now, she believed she could change things. They sat on the back porch one night, drinking lemonade and watching the sun dip behind the Rocky Mountains. "I think I want to start a foundation one day," she said suddenly. "For kids like me. You know, the ones who get ignored because they don't look right or act right or have the right address." Daniel nodded. "You will. And I'll help you build it." She looked at him, serious. "You didn't have to help me that day. You didn't even know me." Daniel smiled. "I didn't know you, but I recognized something. Maybe because I was lost too." Lacey leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thanks for finding me anyway. Before going to next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends." Daniel sat in the old pickup truck, staring at the blank billboard just off I-25 on the outskirts of Denver. The wind was blowing dry dust across the road, and his coffee had gone cold, but he didn't care. In the passenger seat was a folder, thick and worn from being opened and closed 100 times. Inside were sketches, business plans and handwritten notes that Lacey had spent weeks preparing. It wasn't just a dream anymore, it was a blueprint. She wanted to launch a nonprofit that would provide STEM access to underprivileged youth. She had a name picked out, Bright Futures Initiative, and had even started reaching out to local schools. But the folder also contained rejection letters, funding refusals, and patronizing responses that treated her like a kid playing grown-up. That morning she tried to hide the latest email, but Daniel had seen the pain in her eyes when she read it. "They said they don't partner with minor-led organizations," she had whispered. "Even though I'm the one who built the prototype they're using now." Daniel knew he had to do something. This was more than just helping her now. It was about proving that the world didn't get to shut the door on kids like Lacey just because they came from nowhere. So he made calls, sent out emails, and finally reached someone at a local news station. Channel 9 in Denver agreed to do a feature story on Lacey and her work. The reporter, a young woman named Kira Lang, had a soft spot for stories about young innovators. Within a week they had set up an interview. Lacey wore the only decent dress she had, and Daniel borrowed a suit from a neighbor. The interview took place in the duplex small living room, where Lacey had laid out her turbine model and charts. She was nervous at first, stumbling over her words, But when Kira asked her about why she wanted to build bright futures, something changed. Her voice grew steady. Her eyes lit up. She talked about sleeping in shelters, about reading science books by streetlights, and about how one act of kindness had changed her entire life. There are kids out there smarter than me, she said. They just don't get the chance to show it. The segment aired on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning, everything had changed. Daniel's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Emails flooded in, from teachers, tech investors, nonprofits, and even a couple of celebrities who had seen the piece. A woman from a national grant foundation called and asked to speak with Lacey personally. By Friday, they had received an offer of $50,000 in startup funding for the foundation. But what shocked Daniel the most was an email from an engineering professor at Stanford who had seen the segment and invited Lacey to tour the campus and meet with his research team. "Your daughter has a gift," he wrote, "and a vision. We'd be honored to support her education however we can." Lacey was overwhelmed. She kept asking if it was a prank or if someone was going to change their mind. Daniel kept reminding her again and again, "You earned this. No one's giving you anything you didn't already deserve." The tour at Stanford was a whirlwind. They flew to California for the first time, and Lacey was treated like a young prodigy. Professors asked for her opinion on renewable energy models. Students wanted to take pictures with her. She walked across the campus in absolute awe, clutching a notebook filled with scribbles and questions. After one seminar, a researcher told Daniel, "She thinks in systems. That's not something you teach, it's how her brain is wired." When they returned to Denver, the community response had grown. Local tech firms offered to mentor kids through bright futures. A real estate developer donated space in a downtown building for the first official office. Volunteers came from all over to help with painting, wiring, and setting up laptops. Lacey, still just 14, was suddenly leading meetings, organizing events, and mentoring kids just like her. And Daniel, he was the operations guy, the fixer, the one who made sure everything worked in the background. Every night, they still sat on that same back porch, drinking lemonade and going over the next day's plans. But now the stars looked closer and the world felt bigger. Then one morning, a letter arrived from the state's Department of Social Services. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it. It was official. Lacey's guardianship had been fully approved. No more temporary holds, no more interviews or caseworkers. She was his legally and forever. When he told her, she didn't speak at first. She just threw her arms around him and held on so tight he thought she might break his ribs. "I finally have a dad," she whispered. "A real one." And Daniel, who had once sat alone in a motel room thinking his life had no meaning, realized that somehow, the broken pieces of his past had been rebuilt into something stronger, something that mattered. They celebrated with pizza and ice cream, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the Bright Futures office. The walls were still half-painted and the furniture was donated and mismatched, but it didn't matter. Lacey pulled out a folder, another one, and showed him her next idea. A mobile science lab that could travel to rural towns and inner-city schools. "We'll call it the Discovery Bus," she said. "It'll be free. Kids can get hands-on experience with tech, engineering, and design. No lectures, just real exploration." Daniel smiled. "You already have the vision. Let's figure out the wheels." The next chapter of their life had begun. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about legacy. About building something that would outlive both of them. And for the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel like a failure or a man running from his past. He felt like a father. A builder. A believer in a genius girl who once slept on sidewalks and now had the power to change the world. Before going to next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. The Discovery Bus became more than just an idea. By the end of that fall, it was a real rumbling vehicle painted in bright blues and oranges, parked outside a former tire shop near Colfax Avenue in Denver. Daniel had bought a used school bus at an auction, and with the help of volunteers, some engineers, some just neighbors, they gutted the interior and transformed it into a mobile tech lab. Lacey designed the interior herself, sectioning off areas for coding lessons, 3D printing, solar panel demos, and a small reading nook with science magazines and books she had once scavenged for in secondhand bins. It was cramped, slightly chaotic, and not at all perfect, but it was alive with purpose. They took the bus to local elementary and middle schools, where children piled in with wide eyes and hesitant hands. Lacey always started the sessions by saying, "There are no wrong questions here. Only new ones." One afternoon, they stopped at a charter school on the edge of Aurora. A fifth grader named Julian, wearing a too large hoodie and torn sneakers, stepped onto the bus and stood frozen. Lacey noticed him right away and gently asked if he wanted to try building a mini wind turbine. He didn't answer at first, but then he nodded slowly. By the end of the day he had assembled the most efficient model in the group. Julian's teacher pulled Daniel aside and whispered, "He doesn't talk much. He's in foster care. But I've never seen him like this, focused, confident." It hit Daniel hard. He saw pieces of his old self in Julian, the quiet fear, the uncertainty, the longing to be seen. Every week brought new stories. A girl from Commerce City who used the Discovery Bus coding station to write a small app that helped her mom manage her shifts at 3 part-time jobs. A boy in Westminster who told Daniel he wanted to invent a robot that could carry groceries because his grandma's arthritis had gotten so bad she couldn't hold bags. These weren't just kids playing with gadgets. They were young minds exploding with ideas that had never been given room to breathe before. Lacey kept a journal and wrote down every name, every story. "These are the reasons," she told Daniel one night. "When I get tired or discouraged, I'll look back at these pages." As the months passed, local newspapers wrote about the Discovery Bus, and Lacey started getting invitations to speak at education conferences. She always said no to the national ones at first, afraid she wasn't ready. But Daniel gently encouraged her to try. "You've already changed more lives than most people do in a lifetime," he said. "It's time people knew who you are." So when the email came from the Colorado STEM Summit, asking Lacey to be the keynote youth speaker, she said yes, though she admitted she felt like throwing up just thinking about it. The night before the event, they practiced her speech in the kitchen. Lacey stood behind a folding chair and held a spoon like a microphone. Daniel watched her pacing, rewriting parts, chewing her lip. "I don't want to sound like I'm bragging," she said. "I just want them to understand why this matters." He reminded her gently that telling the truth isn't bragging. It's lighting a path. And her story was one that needed to be seen and heard by more than just the kids on the bus. She went to bed that night still anxious but a little more sure. The conference was held in downtown Denver in a hotel ballroom with 300 people. Educators, policymakers, tech entrepreneurs. Lacey wore a navy blazer over jeans, her hair pulled back in a braid. Daniel sat in the back row, his knees bouncing nervously. When she stepped up to the stage, a hush fell over the room. She didn't use a script. She spoke from memory, from experience, from her heart. She talked about sleeping behind gas stations, about scavenging textbooks, about how one man who had nothing to give but his belief had changed the course of her life. And then she talked about Julian and the robot grocery bag idea and the mobile lab. "We don't need to look for the next genius in Silicon Valley," she said. "They're in our neighborhoods. We just need to knock on their doors, hand them a soldering iron and say, 'Show me what you've got.'" By the time she finished, the entire room stood in applause. Daniel couldn't stop the tears that welled up in his eyes. A man seated next to him leaned over and said, "That girl's going to lead something huge one day." Daniel nodded but said nothing. He already knew. Over the following weeks, more doors opened. Funding offers grew. A foundation offered to expand Bright Futures to 2 more states. But with growth came pressure. Journalists wanted stories. Television crews requested interviews. And for the first time, Lacey seemed overwhelmed by it all. One night, after returning from a planning session, she sat silently at the dinner table, barely touching her food. "I miss it when it was just us and the kids on the bus," she whispered. "Now it feels like everyone wants a piece of it, like it's slipping away from me." Daniel didn't offer easy answers. He sat beside her, put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Then let's protect the heart of it. No matter how big it gets, we stay grounded. One kid, one story, one discovery at a time." Lacey nodded, eyes wet but steady. "Promise?" she asked. "Promise," Daniel replied. The next morning they were back on the road in the Discovery Bus, parked outside a middle school in Boulder. The sun was shining and the smell of pine filled the air. As the first group of kids climbed aboard, Lacey smiled, not the nervous, public smile she used for the cameras, but the real one. The one that had always belonged to the girl who knew she was meant for more, even when no one else believed it yet. Before going to next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. Snow had started to fall lightly in Denver, coating the city in a quiet, reflective stillness. The Discovery Bus was parked outside a library near Capitol Hill, humming gently with heat inside while Lacey helped a small group of students troubleshoot a malfunctioning coding module. She had grown into her role naturally, patient, confident, but still curious. Daniel watched from a corner, sipping lukewarm coffee, filled with a strange mixture of pride and quiet awe. He never imagined that adopting a homeless girl would lead him here, to this warmth, to this purpose. But life, he realized, never followed the outlines people drew for it. It was shaped by risk and resilience, by moments when you said yes even when you didn't know how things would turn out. That evening, after the last group had left, they packed up in silence, both tired but content. As they locked up the bus, a young man in a gray hoodie approached them hesitantly. "You're Lacey, right?" he asked. His voice cracked slightly. Lacey turned, cautious but open. "Yes, that's me," she replied. He looked about 19 or 20, with frost clinging to his sleeves and nervousness in his eyes. "I saw your video online. The one from the summit. I just wanted to say thanks. I'm couch surfing right now, but I saw you talk about coding and it made me think maybe I could do something too." Lacey's expression softened. She handed him a card from her coat pocket, just a simple one with the Bright Futures website and a direct email. "Come to one of our open lab days. We'll get you started." The young man clutched the card like it was made of gold. "Really?" She nodded. "Really?" Later, as they drove home in Daniel's truck, the windshield wipers beating a slow rhythm, she stared out at the snow-glazed world. "I forget sometimes," she said softly, "what it was like to be on that side. Wanting help but being too ashamed to ask." Daniel glanced at her, the dashboard lights casting a faint glow across his face. "You didn't ask either," he reminded her. "But you still found a way to be heard." She smiled at that, resting her forehead against the glass. That night, she stayed up late answering emails from teachers across the state, all asking if the Discovery bus could visit their school. Daniel sat at the kitchen table beside her, flipping through a notebook filled with handwritten quotes, design notes, and budget numbers. Neither of them said much, but there was a rhythm to the quiet work, a comfort in knowing the other was near. A week later, they got a call from a local newspaper, the Denver Chronicle, asking to do a feature story on Lacey's journey. She hesitated at first, wary of being put in a spotlight she wasn't seeking. But Daniel encouraged her to think bigger. "It's not just your story anymore," he said. "It's about what's possible for every kid like you. Someone out there needs to read it." The article ran the next Sunday with a photo of Lacey standing in the bus doorway, arms crossed, a soldering iron clipped to her belt. The headline read, "From Homeless to Hero, How One Teen Sparked a Movement." The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in, some from students, others from parents, and many from people who had never written to a newspaper before. One letter came from a retired electrical engineer in Boulder who offered to donate 5 laptops and volunteer twice a week. Another came from a 12-year-old in Cheyenne who wrote, "I thought smart girls didn't come from places like mine. But now I think maybe they do." Lacey read every message. She made a folder of them and called it Fuel, because that's what they felt like, energy to keep going, to keep building. Daniel watched her grow not just into a leader but into a builder of others. She wasn't just changing her own life anymore. She was shifting the path for kids she hadn't even met yet. Before going to next, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends. 2 years later, the Discovery bus no longer roamed only Denver's neighborhoods. It had become a statewide movement. Bright Futures, the nonprofit Daniel and Lacey co-founded, had expanded with 2 more buses, a team of volunteer mentors, and partnerships with schools in Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, and Grand Junction. What started as a quiet act of compassion had become a force reshaping hundreds of lives. But it was never about the numbers for Lacey. It was about the kids. The ones who still sat silently in the back of the bus on their first day, eyes downcast, waiting to see if this space was different from all the others. She remembered that feeling. The doubt, the fear of hoping. And that's what drove her day after day. One chilly morning in March, they received a letter from the White House. At first, Daniel thought it was junk mail, until he read the embossed seal and the elegant type. Lacey had been selected to receive the Presidential Youth Innovation Medal, one of the highest civilian honors for young changemakers. For a moment, both of them just sat at the kitchen table in stunned silence. Lacey picked up the envelope and stared at it. "Do you think this is a mistake?" she asked quietly. Daniel laughed and shook his head. "No, kid. I think the world's just finally catching up to what I've known all along." A month later, they were on a plane to Washington, D.C. Lacey wore a simple black dress and flats. No makeup, no fuss. Just her. At the ceremony, surrounded by senators, tech founders, and philanthropists, she gave a speech that made the room fall silent. "I used to sleep under an overpass not far from Union Station," she began. "People walked by and looked through me like I didn't exist. But I was always there. I was always thinking, always learning. I just needed one person to stop and say, 'You matter.'" She paused, glancing down at Daniel in the front row, his eyes glassy. "Daniel Everett wasn't rich when he found me. But he was the richest man I'd ever met because he gave me something I'd never had before: dignity. If I can offer that to others now, then we both win. The audience gave a standing ovation. But the real moment came later, when a girl with tangled hair and nervous eyes approached Lacey outside the venue. She held a notebook filled with sketches of machines and wires. "Do you think I could be like you someday?" she whispered. Lacey knelt down, placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, and smiled. "You already are." By the end of that year, Bright Futures had received its largest donation yet, $1 million from a Colorado-based foundation that had followed Lacey's journey since that very first local news story. With the money, they opened their first permanent learning center in Denver's Five Points neighborhood, complete with a computer lab, robotics workshop, mentorship rooms, and a safe kitchen for kids who came in hungry. Lacey insisted the building include a small, quiet library room with beanbags and blankets. "Because sometimes," she told the architect, "what you need most is just a warm place to sit and dream." Daniel had transitioned into a full-time director role, handling logistics, grants, and expansion plans. His life had taken a turn no investor pitch or startup ever prepared him for, but it had never felt more right. He finally sold the old truck, the one that had carried them across so many miles of uncertainty. In its place, he bought a simple hybrid van, mostly for hauling equipment and snacks for the kids. It wasn't flashy, but it was dependable. Like him. As for Lacey, she had graduated high school early and was dual-enrolled at the University of Colorado, Boulder, majoring in electrical engineering and sociology. She wanted to build things, but she also wanted to understand people. "I don't want to fix machines," she told Daniel one evening. "I want to fix systems. The ones that fail kids like I used to be." He nodded, proud beyond words. The final chapter of this story wasn't about success in the traditional sense. It was about legacy. Lacey didn't become a billionaire or a tech tycoon. She became something rarer, someone who remembered where she came from and built a bridge back for others. Kids who had been ignored, laughed at, doubted, now had someone to point to and say, "She did it. Maybe I can too." Years later, when a documentary crew asked her what moment changed everything, Lacey didn't talk about the White House or the newspaper headlines. She told them about a rainy night under a downtown bridge, a broken man who handed her a bag of fries and asked her name, not to report her, not to scold her, but just because he cared. "That moment saved me," she said, "because someone believed I was still worth saving." And so the story of a broke ex-millionaire and a homeless genius girl didn't end with riches or fanfare. It ended with classrooms full of light, laughter in neighborhoods once forgotten, and the quiet confidence that change is always possible, when one person decides to see another not for what they lack, but for what they might become. If you've liked this story, please subscribe to our channel, like and share with friends.